And it looks like we're live. Um, hmm. Well, that's no good. Huh, that's worse. Ugh. Hmm. Whatever. Anyway, you get what you pay for. Welcome to the Sunday stream of Adam's Music Box. For today, I want to talk about a question that sort of is in the air in music circles and always sort of has been. Sometimes it's voiced, and sometimes it's just sort of one of those unwritten questions that lingers around. And that question is, why is European classical music, what most people in so-called Western countries tend to just refer to as classical music, why is it so different than any other genre, whether it be the art or classical traditions of other civilizations, whether it be different than folk music or later than popular music? And there is, of course, a very interesting answer that all goes back to the origin of European classical music itself. And this is the liturgical chants of the early Christian church, which later became the chants of the Orthodox Church, which remain rather unchanged in most churches today compared to what they were thousands of years ago. And in terms of the Roman Catholic tradition, we can trace it back to the Gregorian chants, which evolved into more complex harmonic liturgical music, which itself gave rise to both spiritually inclined and secular European classical music. Now, listening to these ancient or near ancient liturgical chants, one notices something straight away. First of all, particularly when one listens to the Orthodox chants, one sees a lack of modern harmony, a lack of polyphony. And this gives it what some call a kind of almost eerie, but at the same time comforting and very almost serious quality, to use non musical words to describe a musical and a spiritual phenomenon. But there's something else you might notice beyond the lack of modern polyphony, and that is a lack of a rhythmic pulse. Now, so many forms of music from across the world, whether modern or ancient, are built around a rhythmic pulse. Look at the ancient, sophisticated drumming of West Africa in places like Ghana and elsewhere, where the tradition of the master drummer derived and has remained somewhat unchanged for a long period of time. This, of course, is a rhythmic tradition where various polyrhythmic patterns, both improvised and not written, but wrote in terms of they're passed on through memory, these are all about different forms of complex rhythms communicating with each other. Again, rhythm is at the center of the entire thing. Look at Indian music, look at raga, and how the tabla really sets the entire pace and the entire sort of feel, the vibe, if you will, of the music. Look at Indonesian gamelan and how the entire thing is about rhythm that then creates the harmony with pitched percussion instruments. Now, it's no surprise that in a lot of ancient musical traditions, or those which derive from ancient music, are very percussive, because after the human voice, which is obviously a invention of God, the first instrument that man invented, so far as we can tell, are various percussion instruments. So it's in that sense no surprise that some of the most ancient forms of music are very rhythmic, because percussion, whether pitched or not, is generally related to the establishment of various rhythmic patterns, a pulse, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Now, when you look at the ancient music, the ancient chanting of the ancient Christian church, the early church, one doesn't see this rhythm. In fact, one sees the notable absence of any percussion instruments. Instead, everything is created by voice, whether one chanting voice alone or in larger churches from larger villages, multiple voices chanting. And there is no pulse. The rhythm, so far as it can be described and sort of sonically observed, if you will, is created as a result of the movements of melody and harmony, monophonic harmony in the early days, and then later in the Western churches, polyphony when that came into it. But the point is, the rhythm is the slave of the harmony and the melody, it's subservient to it. The rhythm goes where the harmony and the melody, the musicians, the spiritual musicians creating this, it goes where they tell it to go. There is no pulse to which one has to obey. And that is relatively unique in the world. I'm not saying it's the only musical tradition that follows this particular format, if you will, but it is certainly the one that has been the most influential. And as we traverse the ancient world into the modern, it's one of the only traditions, as it manifests in European classical music, where rhythm, when it exists, serves a very different role than it does in almost every other artistic, classical, or folkish or pop tradition. Now, in the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the monophonic chanting of the ancient and near ancient world eventually and gradually became polyphonous, the kinds of harmony that we would recognize as modern. And as the music of the church then began to integrate instruments, most notably the organ, we see the early roots of secular European classical music, which was derived from the increasingly musically complex liturgical music. Now, notice again the total absence of percussion instruments. One has the organ, an instrument which, even in its modern classical and in some ways its theatrical presentation, is one where the rhythm is generally subservient to the melody and the harmony. This is something that we tend to refer to in modern nomenclature as tempo rubato, where there's flexibility, where there isn't a strict adherence to a metronomic pulse, but instead where other factors, emotions created by the melody and harmony, are what guide the performer's sense of rhythm. And that, like I said, is really omnipresent in organ performances. And again, no coincidence that when the Western Church decided to incorporate a musical instrument apart from voice, organ was the first one. And organ is an instrument because of its ability to produce complex harmonies and opulent melody lines. It really doesn't require that rhythmic pulse that is necessitated by the mechanics of other major musical styles that are quite old. Now, when European classical music began, we see that percussion is generally something that isn't particularly common. For many centuries, percussion was either an afterthought or totally absent. And when we get into the classical era, or even the late Baroque era, we only see one kind of percussion instrument typically, the sparingly used, at least at first, sparingly used timpani, otherwise known as the kettle drum. Now, this is a pitched instrument, meaning it can play a note on the scale depending on how you tune it. And much of its function in classical music, right into the Romantic era, and we're getting pretty modern now, it's not so much to establish a rhythmic pulse at all, but there to add dynamic flourishes to the rest of the orchestra. So whenever there's a big crescendo, you might hear a timpani roll, you might hear a timpani staccato hit that is accenting a dramatic moment. You might hear the instrument fulfill its pitched role in sort of giving an added sense of tonality to other instruments, particularly the low brass instruments. So you're even when percussion instruments appear in classical European music of, let's say, the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century, its role is very different than, let's say, the Ghanaian drumming of West Africa, or the Indian tabla, or so many other musical traditions that tend to be based around a percussive pulse. Now, as classical music of the European tradition got increasingly sophisticated in the Romantic era, the era that defines the classical music of the 19th century, we still don't see a rhythmic pulse in the way we see it in other types of music. And even as the percussion sections of orchestras get larger, we still see them more as something that adds dynamic flourishes rather than something that establishes a pulse. And by the mid 19th century, you have things like a relatively modern snare drum, a bass drum that you hit with your hand, things like triangle, cymbals of all types. And nevertheless, this truism of percussion existing as a dynamic rather than rhythmic instrument generally holds true for much of this era. And I'm talking an era that's sort of late classical, early romantic. We have people like Beethoven and Schubert. Then we get into people like Schumann, no relationship. It's one of these Iran Iraq things. People like Mendelssohn, people like Liszt, and of course the king of the mid and late 20th century, Wagner. And again, this truism continues through the greats of the late 19th century, the Bruckners, the Richard Strausses, the Dvorak's, and of course, in the 19th century, one major civilization adopts European style classical music, though with its own various cultural, sort of culturally informed styles, and this is Russia. And of course, that same idea of percussion existing as a dynamic rather than rhythmic set of instruments is true in Russian music, which, while not directly derived from an Orthodox tradition, an Orthodox Christian religion that never adopted instrumentation, or in most cases polyphony, certainly not in the Greek or Southeastern European tradition, we nevertheless in Russian music see a similarity with European classical music insofar as the harmony and the melody are what creates the essence of the piece to which the rhythm is at all times subservient. Now, when you get into the modern era, we tend to see some differences. But one of the main differences is what I call the worrying decline in the European classical performance tradition. Now, when you look at the great conductors who learned, who are basically figures that, much like someone who would recite Homeric poetry, they learned through an oral and experiential tradition that was passed on through their elders. Don't make a mistake. Just because European classical music developed one of the most sophisticated written methods to convey music, musical performance was nevertheless, right up until the mid 20th century, heavily dependent on a sonic and oral tradition that was passed on through generations. And when conducting, the leadership of the orchestra, the most important role in the orchestra, pardon me, when this became increasingly complex is the wrong word, but important and central to the development of music in the 19th century, we see the golden age of the school of European conducting. You have people like Arthur Loewe, you have people like Arthur Nikesh, a lot of Arthurs here. And then when you get into the recorded era, you get into people that we have many recordings of, people like Furtwängler, people like Wilhelm Mengelberg. And these people can do on record what we know others of the Wagnerian era were doing based on the written descriptions of their work. And in fact, the written descriptions of European conducting show a very consistent set of exemplars from the era of Beethoven and even before, right up into the mid 20th century when Furtwängler and Mengelberg were still very much alive, well, and recording. Now, what is the best way to describe this tradition? Well, the way I would describe it as one in which the people who create the music, these maestros who transform music on a written page into something living and breathing, something that is informed just as much by the unwritten and unspoken traditions of European cultural and artistic history as anything written down. They realize that in order to create a performance that is emotionally and culturally authentic, one needs to allow the melody and the harmony to shape the rhythm. And as conductors, as maestros who in part help to shape the rhythm. They are indeed creating melody out of thin air based on the roadmap of the written piece. But these great conductors, truly create the melody, and they use the melody and the and the movements in the harmony that they create in order to create a rhythm. But this rhythm, while very much present, isn't one that typically pulsates. And if it might pulsate for a few measures or a few bars, it will change quite rapidly. Everything in the European classical music tradition is fluid, and these great conductors of that golden era, the von Schillings, another great one of that era, they really understood how to do this. Now, as European classical music became further and further detached from the culture of both European and North American societies, this great tradition got gradually boiled down. And because of that, European classical music sort of lost that which made it European. Now, there were, of course, great conductors both in Russia, people like Golovanov, people in Germany like Furtwängler and von Schillings, people in Holland like Mengelberg, people in England like Wood, people in North America like Stokowski, who understood this. So it really went on. And this tradition reached all the way from Russia to the United States in the 19th century and into the mid 20th century. And of course, its antecedents date back further. For older than that, but we only have the written word that describes it, linking it to these traditions. But we have enough of the written word to know that this heavily rubato style, the idea that the rhythm is subservient to the melody that is created, we know that that was a consistent feature of this music from the pre-Beethoven era all the way up to these great men that long lived into the era of recorded sound, and in Stokowski's case, even high fidelity stereophonic sound. Now, what in the middle to the end of the 20th century went wrong? Well, as a society, European and North American cultures tended to detach themselves from the central importance of this kind of music to the cultural life of their societies. And as a result, this level of speciality, this level of well, I don't like the word, but let's just use it for the sake of ease, this level of expertise among the music creating class tended to die off. And what you saw is conductors who might be very well trained and always musically literate. By the end of the 20th century, we see conductors increasingly conducting European classical music as if it was something else. They were using a universalist metronomic approach to the music that could be easily applied to Indian music, Japanese music, Indonesian music, European folk music, any other genre where the pulse is important. Because, of course, in European classical music, the pulse is not important. In fact, the pulse is usually quite absent, and when it's there, it's always changing within a few bars from one another in most cases, sometimes a few measures, as I said earlier. And so the result is that European classical music no longer sounds European. It sounds like something that is just any other style of music, yes, with different harmonic and melodic histories and structures, but the essence of what made this music so very different than every other great musical tradition in the world has been lost. And all you need to do is listen to, let's say, a recent recording of a Beethoven or Brahms symphony, or of a Wagner overture, or a Bruckner symphony, or a Strauss tone poem. Listen to it conducted by the greats of the late 19th and early 20th century, whether it be Strauss himself, whether it be Furtwängler, Mengelberg, von Schillings, Stokowski, Golovanov, and others. You can see my video that I made about the world's greatest conductors, in my opinion. Listen to some of those recordings, and compare that to a more recent recording. And even if you're not necessarily that into this kind of music, even if you've never read a note of music or played an instrument, you'll notice how extremely different the approach is. It sounds like the people playing this music came from entirely different worlds. And psychologically speaking, they absolutely did. I mean, I've done videos on this subject before, the de Europeanification, if you will, of European music, but it really has happened. And again, it's part of this growing global trend to sort of homogenize everything so that everything kind of sounds like everything else. And as a result, many musical traditions, including long hallowed ones like the European classical tradition, are losing their identity. And I find that very sad, not just from a cultural and historical point of view, but from a point of view of the listener experience. Because when you hear European classical music performed as it should be, in concert with its cultural background, it sounds so exciting. And so when people go up to you and say, oh, classical music is boring, they might not actually be unsophisticated. They might actually be telling the truth. Because if you hear these great pieces of music performed in a non European way, they just sound wrong, wrong to the point of being boring. Where if you hear them conducted in the culturally appropriate, correct, and beautiful way, they are so exciting and so riveting, and they have you longing for more and more. So if your friends do think that classical music is boring, tell them to watch not only this video, but my video on the best conductors in all of classical music. Have them then listen to some of their performances. And I guarantee you, most, if not all, of your friends, after hearing it done the right way, will not find it boring. And is there a moral of this story? I suppose so. Every culture ought to maintain its artistic traditions, its artistic purity, because if everything becomes fast food music, cookie cutter art, we'll get to a situation where everything will sound so similar that it will just congeal into white noise. And we'll be living in a society where no one loves music at all because everything will sound like everything else. I don't want that to happen. Luckily, we have some of the greats of European classical music who lived long enough into the age of recorded sound that we can hear the way it's supposed to be done. I'm very thankful for that. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.